Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey, and this is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Today we have Sam Cooper back on the podcast. Sam is an award-winning investigative journalist, author of Willful Blindness, and founder of The Bureau, known for breaking some of Canada's biggest stories on corruption, crime, and politics. Sam, thanks for being here.
Great to be back again.
Looking forward to chatting today, Sam. One thing that I've found fascinating about your work that you've kind of opened my whole perspective to on this is the intersection between crime, government, and business. Now, you have definitely illuminated that in regards to the Chinese Communist Party and how it's infiltrated Western nations, but I even see this with the Khalistani movement. I see this with Hezbollah, as you've been reporting recently. And to me, it starts to see like this, you know, what our intelligence agencies back in the 90s were describing as the unholy Trinity, right? That they work. We think of these as three separate entities, but with all their own aims and objectives. But it's actually like they're kind of three different arms of the same machine. And so I was kind of hoping you could break down for our audience how this unholy Trinity operates.
Yeah. I reported for the Bureau just very recently that Finance Canada in 2025 came out with this incredible report that lays out how Hezbollah and Hamas are involved in transnational money laundering, which involves the theft of vehicles in the Greater Toronto and Montreal area mostly, and then shipping them out to Dubai or Africa. And I've been hammering this point since 2019. I wrote about, based on my sourcing in the U.S. government, how they had been looking into Hezbollah since about 2008 in Canada, and really being stonewalled by the RCMP, which is a different story. But to make the long story short, the DEA, CIA, FBI, they know that Hezbollah, with connections to Latin American cartels, has a very strong basis of financial operations in Canada. So, and this comes from phone taps and global intelligence from the US government. So that's kind of another big picture. And I'm glad that Canadian official reporting has caught up 6 years later to what I reported for Global News back then. And I've been saying and reporting again for the past 2 years about how this connects to the Middle Eastern wars. Money being laundered from through Canadian banks is paying for, terrorist actions and weapons in the Middle East. We could go on and on about that. But to answer your question, Iran and, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamist networks worldwide are the best example of what you speak of. And in a very simplified way, look, Iran has to get around sanctions evasions. The American government, of course, has been, along with Israel and others, trying to stop them from taking over, being the regional hegemon they want to be through nuclear power. And so when you hit a country like Iran with sanctions, they go underground. They use their business class, their intelligence class, which is the Iranian Guards. And these also happen to be the richest business persons in Iran. So what they do is they work along with Hezbollah and the Iranian Guards. They even have something called the business affairs component. That's a wing of Hezbollah specifically tasked to do business, mixing legal. Think about sort of, currency trading shops in North Toronto and blending it with illegal. Those shops collecting drug cash from Latin cartels. And it gets complex, but without rolling too far from my first answer to you here, yeah, you get the elite of the business community in a country working together with organized crime around the world, using underground banking, whether it's casinos, currency shops, the theft of vehicles in Toronto, selling them for a markup in Dubai. You just leech off of society using criminal underground networks. And that way you're getting your business and political objectives for your government, which will be opposed to the West. And it feeds into also academia, protesting, leveraging pressure. Let's think about how this works. Let's say on Ottawa to declare Palestine a state, maybe before it's, a good idea to do that. So there's definitely those wings working together, and they involve organized crime, which is very good at getting around barriers.
So, you've been reporting on this for quite a long time now, and it's very clear to the United States, all of their organizations, all their three-letter organizations you just listed off, which means that we know too. We also understand this. I'm sure that global authorities all know exactly what's going on in Canada. So if everybody knows, including Canada, why is it still allowed to happen?
I really think that this is the battle of our times. I think we've talked before about, my view of how President Donald Trump's tariffs and his rhetoric about the 51st state, while uber aggressive and not a good thing for Canadian patriots, at the same time, I've been making the argument that Canada and its institutions, from banks to law offices to whole cities, I'm saying Vancouver and Toronto, are used very freely by transnational organized crime. Again, connected, China at the top, working with Mexican cartels, and these Iranian Hezbollah networks, which I've just referred to. And again, I'm glad there's more public reporting besides my own coming out on those networks. So why is it still happening in Canada? At the end of the day, I wrote an updated chapter for my book, Willful Blindness, in the past year. And the last chapter was basically focused on the threat of state capture. And I know that's an alarming concept, but countries like China get significant, if not outright, control of countries in their orbit. Cambodia, Singapore, Pakistan, which most people don't know, could be called a Chinese proxy. Iran, it's in that world, could also be called a Russian proxy. So when your elite, when your institutions are significantly influenced by these underground criminals that look like elite corporate businessmen, especially within diaspora communities, which are not very well understood, upon arrival in a new country like Canada, I think that's how Canada is in danger of not only elite capture. What do I mean by that? I mean, you can be a Chinese businessman in Toronto running grocery stores, developing condos around the country, and you can be a secret, you can be running underground casinos, you can be laundering fentanyl money, and you can be supporting Justin Trudeau, which I think happened in the past few elections. So if your leader of your country is under significant potential influence from a foreign proxy actor, that's how this garbage would keep rolling in Canada. And I've wiped away with the niceties of academic language recently because I just think Canada is on the tipping point of being in that state capture threat zone. And it's just more Canadians need to know the reality.
Well, I'm completely on board with you about kind of removing the niceties here and getting into a much harder conversation for a lot of Canadians to maybe hear, because, even go back to 2016, the Justin Trudeau speech at the Shanghai Canada-China Business Council, where he said, and this is a verbatim quote, is the success of the world is inexorably linked to the success of China. He's placing the value of the Chinese nation above even the world. He's like, the world depends. So he's placing more importance on the success of China. Everything is downstream from China's success. And then, so you see this with Canada, and let me know if my framing here is correct, is that, okay, you've got this unholy trinity of, say, Chinese state actors between the business front, the triads, the criminal element, and then also the united front kind of diplomacy arm. In this wing, in this unholy trinity, is essentially the logistics. Then you've got the muscle, which would be like the Mexican cartels, and they're kind of the brash, forceful front of it. And then you've got the Khalistani element and the kind of running the distribution for these networks through trucking and such in Canada. And then so you've got these three elements, these three unholy trinities and nations, what being the figurative nation of Khalistan, and Mexico and the cartels, and then also China, and they're working in alliance to try to take down the West.
And let's throw Hezbollah in there too, which is very important. All the reporting I've done on the super labs, and including I did a big scoop a while ago on a little known carfentanil case in Toronto that was very ignored by the media. People will recall that, you know, a family was involved and someone, you know, died after shooting a couple people in downtown Toronto. But the deeper story behind that was Pakistani threat networks, carfentanil. I've just told you that Pakistan is a proxy state of China. So the lab activity, yeah, that's going on. It's happening out west, Iran, Mexico, China up top. So I think you're exactly right. And the example I bring, and I state it carefully, is, you know, speaking of the people in suits, Canada has something called the Canada-China Business Council, which, as you know, is this high-level lobby with everyone from the Power Corporation of Quebec, I believe a few of our big banks in there, if not Air Canada, probably Bombardier, you know, all these big corporations that benefit from trade with China. You've got people like Dominic Barton and, you know, Scott Bryson, the elite of liberals. You can go to the website and look at the pictures, and then you'll find another guy who I'm just not going to name in this podcast, who is the person that I assert is referred to in Canadian intelligence reports, which affirmed a lot of my reporting from the election interference. This guy is called a high harm proxy that CSIS is concerned is doing egregious harm to Canada. He sits on the Canada-China Business Council. You can look up some of Andy Lee's posts on X. She hasn't been sued yet, but my thing here is that when Justin Trudeau in 2016 says those words, I don't think they really developed in his brain. I think they came from conversations in the Canada-China Business Council more directly, certainly from someone like a Dominic Barton. I don't have the email or the tape recording, but absolutely, he's the type of person that pushes that line of thinking for various reasons. And so that Canada-China Business Council with the Power Corporation, again, read up, this is just open source, that has been behind pretty much all Liberal prime ministers. That corporation and its entities, along with Jacques Chrétien, was directly involved in business relationships with Chinese Communist Party corporations, which are intelligence fronts, and this is reported solidly. So, yeah, you're talking about sort of the body by which, my word again would be elite capture or state capture, makes some strange things happening in Canada, and why Justin Trudeau would say that. Why did Mark Carney, as the Bank of England governor back in 2012, say something very similar when he was talking about making a renminbi or Chinese yuan sort of deal with the Bank of England to simplify it? He's saying China is important for, the future of the world economy, the very same language. And I think it comes from that sort of Canada-China Business Council nexus.
So, we were talking about Justin Trudeau and things he was saying in 2016, but one of the things we know happened since 2020, 2021, the number of organized criminal groups in Canada increased from 2,000 to about 4,000. It nearly doubled. And with that, they're making the assumption that there's about 150,000 organized criminals. So career criminals, not random carjacking, but people that know what they're doing and this is what they do for a living. So it's increased so significantly over the last 5 years. I'm of the opinion, and based on what you're saying, it sounds very accurate. They've infiltrated all of our organizations because that's how you survive and thrive as a criminal organization. So if there are 150,000 people in this country, in and out, operating in this space, how do we possibly get our country back?
That is that's really the question on my mind all the time. I would say it's why I've got a lot of high-level U.S. government sources now, because I think they're very aware of those concerns. And just break down your great data point, the growth in criminal groups over the past 5 years, I'm certain is partly attributable that Mexican cartel infiltration and direct sourcing of cocaine and methamphetamine, pushing it up into Canada through people like our former Olympian, I won't call him Ryan Wedding, who has become we have a new nexus of Canadian domestic-based, let's call them partners of the cartels that involve domestic crime, Ryan wedding, allied with Iranian state adjacent crime networks. Back to what we were talking about, Hezbollah, Iranian security figures working with cartels. And so that nexus is now flooding cocaine and methamphetamine to this great growth of crime groups from street level players all the way up to the former sort of, we can call them, let's call them the choke point of all that drugs from Mexico coming in was the mafia and the Hells Angels. Again, police in Quebec have said this. So what's the effect? Cocaine used to cost $40,000 a kilo in early 2000s when the choke point was the mafia and the Hells Angels. Now that we have these global players with the Ryan weddings moving it across all these new gangs, it's dropped to 20,000. So again, I could go on and on. To your point, how do we get our country back? Let's look at how we lost it. Drugs are flooding in. Super labs are pushing the fentanyl out. The cocaine and meth is coming in. Our ports are captured. Again, you can read this in a report from a former State Department official. Our banks, we know, we've probably talked about the TD Bank case. Our political class, it was captured partly by this organized crime flood. Where's the corruption? CBSA, RCMP, proven cases, some of it sourced from my American and Canadian expert, let's just call them friends on the inside. Some of this in documents, like the Cameron Ortis case that I detailed fully in my book and at the Bureau. So again, he was RCMP's intelligence chief, selling or trying to sell information to the Mexican cartels and Hezbollah players in Vancouver and their encryption technology hub. Sometimes I feel like I could go on and on for a few hours, but I haven't answered your question, how we get our country back. As a Canadian, I don't like the threat of the 51st state, but if it results in real laws in Canada to combat, we've talked before how we don't have a racketeering law, how the Charter of Rights, unfortunately, which is a good tool for good people, is being used to protect these gangs. They come here because it's easy pickings, easy regulatory environment. So we need powerful laws. And if it's Donald Trump acting like an authoritarian towards Ottawa, okay, I'll take it. Give us the new laws and then we can push back.
Well, even to your point there, like, you know, I'm a very liberty-minded person. That's one of my core principles. So the idea of authoritarian action doesn't sit well with me at all. But I look at the landscape of what we're seeing with, you know, these networks that you've been outlining for years upon years, and there's zero conversation in Canada about it from any of our political class. So like it doesn't seem to me like they have a will or they even want to. It's not even like they've correctly diagnosed a problem, but they're sitting there and don't know how to deal with it. It's that they refuse to admit this problem exists. And I would even, again, to your point about being polite, like I would even argue that they're completely complicit in it, that they're okay with it, that they're actively allowing it to happen. And then so you look at somebody like Trump, and let's say even just outside of Trump, the American establishment, the DOJ, the DEA, the FBI, all of this, if they want to do something about the Canada problem, because we're not doing anything about it, they only have two levers to pull, which is either economic force or military force, and from an authority standpoint. And it's like, hey, we should be maybe glad that they're pulling the economic lever.
I'll take the economic over the military.
Like,
and
yeah.
I mean, just to reiterate, like, you know, my case here that Canada doesn't have the laws, and so the U.S. government has to do something. I just wrote another deep dive into who this Ryan Wedding guy is, and people can look it up. His lieutenant was taken down by the Mexican Navy off Guadalajara. You know, Canada wasn't doing anything about Wedding and his murderous cells working with the cartels. People were dying like flies as Wedding started to try to consolidate the business and also get any police pressure from the U.S. off him. And what's the proof here? Wedding's lieutenant is charged with 4 murders that happened in Ontario, but he's charged by the U.S. government. So it's like, what more proof do you need that people are dying in Canada? Our RCMP and police agencies aren't doing anything about it. Why could it be that, he was using Indo-Canadian trucking companies, many of them, for his haulage, as I've wrote, many of those companies possibly, tight with, let's say the investors or owners of those companies being used in drug haulage close to the Liberal Party. I think that could be happening, just like I'm saying, very senior sort of what would appear to be corporate people in the Chinese Canadian community who are really organized crime bosses being close to the Liberals and Justin Trudeau. Yeah, that's a factor. And it's other parties too. I'm just saying the Liberal Party appears to be the most captured. So again, if the US government is saying, work with us on those fentanyl super labs, don't stonewall us, as I reported for the Bureau, which happened, coming all the way from Derek Maltz. This is an on-the-record source. The former chief of the DEA said the Falklands Super Lab was a major disaster because Canada wasn't sharing, wasn't working together. The American government is saying, get some real laws, take care of your people. If you're not taking care of your people and the American government has a better solution, again, I'm saying a little bit of pressure from Washington on Ottawa, there could be a silver lining in that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I don't really see any other way. I don't see any other path to success for us to sort of correct course at this point. But it's crazy that you need leverage from another country to try to help the people of Canada. There's an interesting stat that came out the other day. It was that the majority of Canadians, I believe it was 51%, don't feel safe in their own neighborhoods anymore, and 54% feel that the justice system is working against them, which is an interesting, you talk about how you've been covering these things for a decade or more, and now finally the mainstream media is covering it. And so there are these layers to things. It's kind of like the diffusion of innovations curve, right? And you're an innovator. You're there first. But when the majority of Canadians no longer feel safe and the majority of Canadians no longer feel that the justice system is working for them, the impact of what you're talking about is starting to hit home. I just don't think people understand exactly why they're feeling that way. But I think this is the most significant reason.
I agree exactly. And, what was on my mind is we're talking about what would it take to turn Canada around. Really, it's only reporters like myself and podcasters like you that are having these conversations. And again, when I listen to myself talk, sometimes I'm thinking that's some pretty hard stuff to believe. And yet I know with my full mind and body that it's all proven. And that's why I'm still at it. But yeah, if people are reading the Globe and Mail or just zoned into the CBC and CTV, and they're being told the Prime Minister is right. It's only 1% of fentanyl from Canada. Meanwhile, the people in Washington are saying, no, you got super labs. And, who do you turn to these days, to believe? So I do think, the only solution here is that people are more paying attention to these types of conversations. And hopefully it's starting to sink in. I say, I reported in 2019, when your car is disappearing from Toronto and ending up in Dubai, there's an international terror financing group behind it. Did it get any real traction? Not that much. But if people, 50% and more are thinking, do I have to illegally start to have weapons in my home to protect my family? Like you, I'm saying my theory is, this is the absolute flood of drugs into Canada. And so you have what you've said, all the increase in gangsters, whether they be street level crews or not. Look, there's low priced drugs flooding into Canada. Let's steal from homes, get some money up so we can buy some, ship it to, let's get our thing going. I think that's a big part of the disorder, from car theft to home invasion. Of course, we have, zombied out, unfortunately, opioid synthetic addictions crossing the country. Again, I like to tell people I was there in 2013 in Vancouver when fentanyl exploded. I left that city. Now I'm seeing the same things across Ontario, the country. And of course, that will add to those home invasions. So yeah, I do think there's a much bigger reason for this feeling of not feeling safe in your home anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point you made there about how you're seeing an increase in crime because people are seeing opportunity if the drugs cost less and there's more organized crime. And now there's larger international organizations that are willing to partake in purchasing the goods from Canada. Maybe it's stolen cars, etc. That's actually a really good point as to why you're seeing this massive expansion. It's not just our lax crime laws. It's the fact that we're actually a pretty supple market. But on that point, I kind of wanted to dig in a little deeper to the Hezbollah Hamas side of things, because for a lot of people, this is new information. I know we discussed China and sort of the larger networks, but would you mind expanding down that line a little bit?
Yeah. So Hezbollah, the party of God in English, this, the political wing that is connected to the government of Lebanon, or was. They're on the run now. They're a client, or is it the other way around, of Iran's state. So this global political party, these terror financiers, these terrorists, are an international powerful organized crime group that, they have very sophisticated members in the community that look like business people. They may be running car shops, restaurants, developing real estate, running currency exchanges, but they're Hezbollah. So they're working with drug dealers, human traffickers, prostitution, moving people, goods, commodities around the world. And they have become, partly because of Canada's weak financial laws, partly because of our immigration laws, our lack of border controls. They have many high-level operators in Canada that shouldn't have come in, and then just within the diaspora, which is, of course, most, the vast majority come here for democracy and a better life and good people. But within that diaspora will be, a lot more opportunity for gang, sort of Iranian-based Middle East gangs to operate. So Hezbollah, what the intelligence documents say, some crazy points. They're hugely embedded with the Venezuelan government. As I've written again and again about the Ryan wedding case now, this former Olympic snowboarder, he marries some woman from the Iranian community who's involved in these, I say, state-adjacent underground banking networks that move, drug proceeds around the world without having to do bank transfers. They're also helping Iran evade sanctions. So what do you know? Ryan Wedding and his friends are using Venezuela to move Mexican drugs, from another country up into Canada and then bounce it off into other areas. So Hezbollah, that is the crime piece, the political piece, the financial jobs for Iran piece. And there's also the extremist piece. They are there, as this recent Canada Finance report said, along with Hamas. They're involved in the extremism activity on our campuses. They're involved in pressuring our government. They have charities that are really, money laundering operations and political pressure operations. And you mentioned China and how we've talked a lot about China, but their operations are very similar. They surround politicians with community members that appear to be, successful business people, but they're working for another state or another, religious entity, an extremist entity. And so that's what Hezbollah and Hamas, how they're using Canada. And that involves fentanyl money laundering. It involves the car theft we've talked about, and it involves the, I believe, although not reported overtly in Canada, it was just reported in Australia. They gave Iranian diplomats the boot because they found that, Jewish synagogue and businesses were shot up, or rather firebombed, by, these Iranian or Hezbollah networks. And as Australia's intelligence chief said in his quote, it's like a layer cake of proxies from the Iranian security and Hezbollah all the way down to the gangsters that are doing those attacks. So yeah, same as the Chinese Communist Party, but on a different level, a lower level, and a different way.
Well, I think another thing to go over here, maybe a little bit more in depth, is something you mentioned about the charities, because, man, I've had a lot of illusions stripped over the last 5 to 10 years, but I think one that was like a defining moment is how I just looked at our capacity, like just humans across the board, to do terrible things. Like the charity aspect was a defining one for me, because it's been going on for decades. One example is I was reading a book called The Ghosts of Medak Pocket about a Canada peacekeeping mission during the Yugoslavian wars. And they were detailing, now they were talking a lot about the war itself and what Canadian soldiers went through. However, I was fascinated by this like footnote in the book about how at the time that these wars were going on, you had the Croatian diaspora groups within Canada fundraising for humanitarian efforts, that money was going over to Croatia to fund their military aims in the war aims in the Yugoslavian wars, and then Canadian soldiers were going over there and fighting them. So like diaspora groups in Canada were funding the very militaries that our people were going over and having to get into violent conflict with. And then you've got, okay, so that's the Croatia aspect, but then we even just saw recently with Gary Sundanundegree, right? The liberal safety minister, where now he's been caught in 3 different scandals tied to the Tamil Tigers, which is a terrorist organization. And one of the things that we saw, this was the most recent scandal that he came up in, is that when the RCMP raided one of their offices, they found his name tied to fundraising efforts. And what this organization was doing was over here trying to get money from the Sri Lankan diaspora communities for humanitarian efforts to deal with the tsunami that had happened and displaced people. And that's how they sold it. And they took that money and they were funding their terrorist insurgencies over there. And so like, I look at this now and go, okay, yeah, it's very easy for me to connect the dots and go, crime is funding terrorism. Like those things don't seem out of place. But then we see this larger issue where we've got foreign nations that are hostile to the West fundraising in the West under the guise of altruism to fund their efforts to destabilize us. Like that to me is just a level of depravity that I actually find hard to juggle with.
Yeah, no, I mean, all the cases you laid out, I agree with. My colleague Stuart Bell at Global News, former colleague that I worked with on a lot of national security stories. He's probably the go-to guy on looking into terror networks in Canada. So when he started working on our public safety minister, I knew that he had been looking into the public safety minister and his wife, and how, as a lawyer in the community, they were very, very involved, let's say, in a lot of things that are, I'll leave it to Stuart to report more. I think he's got more, but I guess my takeaway point is in the big picture, it's kind of the frame what we're talking about. I think Canadians need to understand that as conflict rises around the world, we definitely will feel it, in Canada. And that has been that knowledge, or rather that understanding of the world, unfortunately, I think has been lacking, for decades. And again, we had it pretty good. We were living very safely to the point where, a lot of us, not me, a lot of Canadians could look down their nose at the Americans who do get into some rather questionable wars, but on the other hand, they know how to protect their people. And we've been free riding on that while not understanding with what was going on in the Balkans. Yeah, you need to understand what's going on there when someone knocks on your door and asks for donation, and think a little bit deeper about how money flows around the world. I agree. And I just hope that more Canadians, without becoming cynical or judgmental, are educating themselves more about geopolitics and how that should inform their day-to-day decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I wish more Canadians would do the same. I just think it's such a tall order. Our mainstream media is captured, right? If 85% of your media is subsidized by the government, and 90% of all mainstream news, 90% of all news consumed by a Canadian comes from a subsidized source, you're in trouble, right? So for me, I don't have a lot of faith in the institutions and the institutional media, but I do have faith in guys like us and guys like you that are doing this. And I am hopeful that more people kind of catch on. But we'll sort of see where that goes. But I want to change gears. I have a question for you because I haven't spoken to you since this. How much foreign interference do you think was involved in the last federal election?
Wow. Okay. I'm spinning my mind back, and I'll talk about the story I broke and pushed, because it's a huge example that's little understood and it's important. So this guy, Paul Chain, Toronto area Liberal MP, makes a comment in early January 2025, to a group of Chinese Canadian journalists, so a diaspora group, and he says his potential opponent from the Conservative Party, who is a migrant from Hong Kong, Joseph Tay, he says he's under a national security law, bounty in Hong Kong. Maybe you could turn him over to the consulate. And he framed it like a joke, but it wasn't a joke. It gets reported by, whether it's Ming Pao or Sing Tao, don't quote me on that, one of those. It gets reported, so disseminated out into the community. And I'm sort of backing and forwarding here, but you can see what happened there. An MP voices a threat from China against the one person that China most does not want to be elected to parliament, Joseph Tay, because he's a Hong Kong democracy advocate, now, facing persecution from China illegally in Canada. And so the MP says it, which is brutal. It's disseminated in the media. And remember, I've reported, based on CSIS leaks, on how CSIS believes all Chinese Canadian media in Canada is captured. There's no one that's not doing Beijing's narratives. That's just the way it works. The messaging is disseminated from the consulates, like Toronto. I wrote about how a consul, my intelligence documents said, there's a group of 30 to 40 Chinese journalists that get together in Toronto and talk about how stories should be reported. So without going too wide, this looks like a clear example of that happening. And then, how did the story unroll? I report, and then others, about this indirect threat from Paul Chain. Mark Carney is confronted with this information, but won't ask him to step down. The story rolls forward. What did I break? I broke that Joseph Tay, meanwhile, who's moved to another riding, Don Valley North, let's leave it at that, to run as a Conservative, he is being told by the RCMP, it's not safe for you to go out and campaign in person. So this is something I reported and proved. Meanwhile, as the election is happening, we have this new public real-time election threat monitor site who's calling press conferences now and then and saying they have detected threats. So they spoke about, they discovered that China had started to disseminate high-level cyber messages throughout the community that Joseph Tay, if he's elected, bad things will happen, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm showing in this one case is how a Liberal MP is working along the same message line as the confirmed Chinese intelligence interference. Mark Carney does not pull him back. Pressure mounts. Mark Carney replaces him with another candidate who just happens to be a former Toronto police officer who himself has been frequently pictured with the same, let's just call them, I'll come out and say it, Hanmen, gangsters, quote unquote, community leaders in Toronto that have been meeting with this Toronto police officer who suddenly he's the replacement candidate. I then break the news that he had traveled with various people from the consulate to a Beijing Chinese Communist Party victory parade back in around 2015. So you can just see captured writings, tremendous alleged interference happening. And the other big one was Mark Carney. The Globe and Mail broke this story. He had met, I guess secretly, while he was running to replace Justin Trudeau, with one of these Toronto area community groups, which the Globe and Mail reported, and I did as well, is very clearly and overtly aligned with Beijing's United Front Work Department. So was Mark Carney being, puppeted at all in that whole scenario with Paul Chain and his replacement. That's just a tight nexus of what I saw. As it looked like significant interference to me. And yet at the end of the day, we had the election, the greatest gaslighting election in Canadian history, as I call it. And that very same public site task force, I think their judgment was they came out and said that we didn't really see any real interference. Again, I step back with what I know from the prior elections, and I think there's very serious things going on in what I just mentioned, and that's only what was seen. What was happening out in British Columbia, what was happening with other parties.
Before we move on to the next topic, this episode is brought to you by The Tallow Truth. Would you ever eat your skincare? No? Then why put it on your skin, your body's biggest organ? Most skincare products are loaded with chemicals that absorb straight into your body. That hydrating cream might as well come with a hazard warning. Your skin needs real nourishment, not lab experiments. That's why I use F-Bomb from The Tallow Truth, made from grass-fed, grass-finished tallow. It's also hormone-free, antibiotic-free, steroid-free, GMO-free, and even vaccine-free. Nothing artificial, nothing toxic, just results. I've been using F-Bomb from The Tallow Truth for almost a year now, and honestly, I'm never going back. My skin feels hydrated, my fine lines are reducing, and I just look better. Plus, I'm already 40. This shit's not going to get any easier for me. But what makes The Tallow Truth even better is that they're a Freedom First brand that supports Blendr News and everything we stand for. They even offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you've got nothing to lose. So, go to thetallowtruth.com/blender and use code BLENDR, BLENDR, for 15% off. This includes 15% off already discounted bundles too, so you can save as much as 40%. That's thetallowtruth.com/blender, code BLENDR at checkout for 15% off.
Well, I just want to maybe touch on the scale of these operations then, because I think, I'm constantly readjusting to how major this is within our society, because, when you first start looking into this stuff, I think, your initial reaction is probably, this happens in the shadows, these money laundering networks, these crime networks, these influence networks. This is just kind of something happening. Let's say it's moving the needle 0 to 3% of our society. Like it's not that major, which I would even argue is major if you're like a 3% efficiency rate in that realm. But you look at the money laundering scale in Canada, conservative estimates are, and I don't mean the Conservative Party, I mean like conservatively estimating, you're looking at around $45 to $50 billion a year being laundered through our banks. And then I've seen some estimates that go up as high as 110, 120, $130 billion a year. And if you look at that, okay, the conservative estimates would be still that money laundering is a top 20 industry in Canada. If you take the high estimates, it's a top 10 industry, top like 10. Bigger than our agriculture. And so you think about this, you go, okay, let's just treat this crime network as any other industry. Like, how much lobbying power does the agricultural sector have? The oil and gas sector, like how much influence do they have over things? It's probably enough that you could argue it's significant. Well, if this industry is larger than those industries
and growing quickly
then you have to assume that they actually have more influence than even those industries in our system.
That's a great point. And I have strongly estimated that just looking at the Chinese underground banking networks, which I sort of led the world in exposing the quote Vancouver model, I showed that it's really the Toronto model, and it involves fake fraudulent mortgages, run through our banks. It involves Toronto. It evolved from the pandemic when it was a lot of casinos. And now the U.S. Treasury has come out with major data point studies pointing to $312 billion in Chinese network money laundering in 4 years in that country. Canada, of course, a smaller country, but proportionately for the Chinese underground banking networks, which again, the U.S. Treasury now coming out and saying, which handle all the money laundering for the Mexican cartels. That's happening in Vancouver and Toronto at scale. I estimated strongly through industry sources and various, a FinTrack study, should be over $1 trillion money laundering in the past decade, Vancouver and Toronto. So to your point about the top 10 industry, I think money laundering may be a top 5. Real estate in itself, let's look at Gregor Robertson, the new housing minister. I know very deeply because I reported for the Vancouver Sun and Province as a City Hall reporter, watched him come up as a mayor. His biggest supporters, his most influential supporters were condo developers. You know, back when I was breaking the mold on how much Chinese money is influencing, people were calling me and anyone else that tried to dig into it racist. Those developers behind Gregor Robertson, now the Canadian housing minister, back then were saying foreign money is maybe only 2%, if anything. Now, as we know, they're lobbying the government in Vancouver, please give us more foreign money or else we'll go under. So the proof is in the pudding there. And again, to hammer a fine point over and over, you can only take 50,000 per year out of China legally. So it's coming in underground. It's flooding Vancouver and Toronto. And that's just the Asian diaspora. Remember, at the start of this podcast, we talked about how Mexico, world cartel money, Iranian underground banking, Hamas, Hezbollah, they're all mixed in. Let's talk about the Sri Lankan community, which has some interesting things going on in real estate in Toronto that I haven't even got to. And yeah, we're getting hit with the world's underground money, and it's a huge industry.
What's happening with the Sri Lankans and the real estate in Toronto?
Oh, people,
if you can get into it today.
I can get into it a little bit. I won't name the person, but there was a person very concerned with figures of corruption from his government. He said that he followed my work on Chinese corruption and money laundering and said, you need to go down to Bluffers Park in Scarborough, or there's certain streets where X official, Y official. And, you know, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. It's like I haven't been able to get to it yet, but we talk about our public safety minister and how he may be involved in questionable activities with offshore networks. Yeah, maybe there's something to look into there. I haven't got into it yet, but I think that's just another community that has a lot of influence and may be also, from my network diagramming, I noticed that our public safety minister was quite close to the Chinese community networks as well. So there could be a lot of stuff going on that hasn't surfaced.
So we're seeing a lot of different organizations around the world infiltrate Canada, and they may have been here for decades upon decades. It's becoming a lot more prominent or prevalent. And now we're seeing it sort of expand, like we discussed earlier through the podcast. This is alarming for Canadians. If you hear this and you're not tapped into what we talk about and what you talk about constantly, this is pretty alarming information. Now, is Canada in a unique position where we are one of the most infiltrated countries, or is this becoming commonplace in the West? Like, are we an ultimate weak point because of bad policy, or is this just what's happening throughout, Australia, America, the UK, Europe?
It's definite. If we're talking about transnational organized crime, ability to use a G7 nation, there's no question. Canada is the worst. Canada, its lack of a racketeering law. I've reported, at length now about how rules like Stinchcombe force our police, even if they wanted to investigate some of these politically connected senior money launderers that may be important to, certain parties' elections. Even if the RCMP wanted to, they often say we would be forced, if we get American intelligence, to disclose, the FBI, the DA's sources and methods, so cases don't go forward. So again, to your question, yeah, Canada in the Western world is an outlier. And I say that is why our real estate prices are an outlier. If you look at a graph of, Spain, UK, Australia, yeah, they got some big prices, but Canada's off the charts. So I think even more than everyone knows, the irresponsible flood of immigration under the Trudeau government, but the money came first. Right. The money comes first, as one of these condo kings that supported Gregor Robertson memorably said, and I remembered it recently, the money comes first and then the people. It comes first through criminal underground channels. And Canada is a fertile ecosystem for transnational foreign organized crime. So are we worse than Australia on that? Yeah, I think we are. Remember also, Australia just has major legitimate trade with China, as legitimate as it gets with a Belt and Road country. But, so they're going to be hit with a lot of wealthy Chinese people that may not be quite as, let's just call it, narco adjacent as I'm saying Vancouver and Toronto is. But my answer on this is, in the Western world, Canada is an outlier in terms of foreign organized crime using our economy and institutions.
Well, I'm just going to lay out another perspective. I keep giving you perspectives and hoping you'll tell me I'm wrong, but so I read a book by Misha Glenny, who is a BBC reporter, called McMafia. And essentially the thesis of this book is great. Actually, Canada had its own chapter in it, is that after the 1990s, with the fall of the Soviet Union, geopolitically, you essentially had two major powers that were having all other interest groups bend the knee to them. You either bent the knee to the Soviet Union or you bent the knee to America. And that, after the Soviet Union disappeared, what filled that vacuum was organized crime. So his whole thing is, even in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, all of this, because the Soviet Union had significant influence in the Middle East, is that these terror networks and these organized crime networks actually took up essentially the governing position that the Soviet Union had held. And so I'm starting to view the world as kind of like, maybe this, I even struggle with these narratives sometimes, because I think there's holes on even our end, but you've got the world split into the Allies and the Axis. And at this point, I'm starting to view the world as you've got legitimate nations fighting organized crime nations, and they're slowly winning, these organized crime nations, to the point with Canada, you look at Canada as a target for a nation, to what it would, the value that it holds, even Australia, yeah, it's a major player on the global stage, but Canada is your back door into the largest market in the world. They, just like any other person, would want to be able to sell their products to America, whether it's, just standard stuff we use day to day, or whether it's drugs. It's we are a back door into that economy for them. So I very much struggle to see any way that, we're not target number one for this node, for this kind of axis power of organized crime.
Yeah, to your point, I'm not going to disabuse your theory, though, because I didn't read McMafia, but there's a great book called Putin's People. It's by a former Reuters journalist. I think she got sued by 4 or 5 oligarchs and won. So that's great news. Kleptopia. And they point to the very same thing. So I'm saying, yes, Soviet Union falls. There's gangsters named Semyon Mogilevich, very close to Putin, Boris Berstein, both with interests in Canada. But in that time period, they work together with KGB and security services, the biggest business people, to, grab all the assets and move them around the world, partly for their own self-enrichment, partly as, the new Russia, the new KGB operations. So Semyon Mogilevich, one of those books, said that he basically owned the resource industry in Ukraine. Boris Berstein, the same. Boris Berstein, very, I think he lives in Bridal Falls or one of these Toronto neighborhoods, or did. So what I'm saying is they were used strategically to take Ukraine before, years, decades later, Russia took it militarily. And yes, they're involved in the oil patch in Alberta, as I've reported. They're involved in real estate in Toronto. They're even down in Florida. So the United States and its law enforcement, it doesn't have a perfect hammer either. But yeah, what you wrote is accurate, and them as a tool of narco or organized crime statecraft, yeah, that's a real thing. And I agree with you. My fear is that they are winning in Canada.
Okay, before we wrap up today, is there anything else that's really important that we missed that's happened since the last time we spoke to you that we think we should shine a light on for Canadians?
Oh, man. I mean, I'm glad we talked about Hezbollah and Hamas. I think I want to hammer home that, everyone can have a humane view in the Middle East, but people need to understand that what's happening on our universities and our streets, whatever your geopolitical understanding or view is, these people are part of gangster networks. So I don't care, I'm going to separate my view, what's going on in the Middle East. I don't want them operating I don't want people stealing our cars, laundering fentanyl proceeds to be involved in politics in Canada. That's my simplistic view. That's my red line. I'm glad we talked about that. I've been looking more into the Muslim Brotherhood. I did a story about how, Marco Rubio and the State Department are looking at whether to classify, this global extreme Islamist network, which runs Charities in Canada and is very strongly set up in Canada. Again, people are free to their views around the world. I don't want wars anywhere, but I don't want foreign powers pushing down on, our freedom of speech and expression or what's going on in our country. So that's something that's kind of a new area of exposition that I'm digging into. And I'm glad you saw the connections between, we've hammered home what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And I say they're the number one threat. They've got the long-term view, but they're working together with these other threat networks we talked about today, who are very bad in their own right.
We can acknowledge that there's an atrocity and a tragedy occurring somewhere. And then we also have to be able to simultaneously understand that there are hostile people trying to weaponize that atrocity to inflict, whether it be in our universities or our political systems, that they are looking to destabilize our own societies on the backs of this. And those to me need to be two separate conversations that I don't really think most people have the emotional baseline, I think, to be able to pull those two things apart. But I guess the last thing I'd be interested to pick your brain about is, if, let's say, because a lot of people that listen to us, I do find they're very tapped in. They know what's going on. But for those people that are trying to get through to, say, the average Canadian who still believes in this utopic idea that all we have to do is love and be compassionate and, we're all going to sing Kumbaya on a global stage. If you wanted to start picking away at that illusion for people and kind of give this more pragmatic, actual, realistic view of how geopolitics in these hostile nations and crime organizations operate, what do you think is the first thread that people would need to pull? Let's say I want to convince my mom that maybe things aren't the way that they are, that she thinks they are in Canada. What's the first entry point for somebody like that?
That's a great question. And I'll hit it high and low. So again, reiterating the point that you guys brought up, the crimes that you're seeing, if you're an Ontario resident, not feeling safe in your home anymore, this is not the Canada you're used to. Why did it happen? And I'm saying that absolute flood of transnational crime, the explosion of different gangs that you guys have outlined, the flow, just the incredible, people don't understand the flow of drugs coming in almost exclusively through Indo-Canadian owned trucks, and how they're working with the cartels, the Chinese Communist Party, funding the precursors. This is helping drugs move around the world. They're using Canada, but that's exploding on our streets in the crime and violence, I believe. So that disorder you're seeing, there's an attack factor. And again, the US government believes that, Venezuela, Iran, the Chinese Communist Party wants to see that destabilization. And I think my reporting has shown solidly that's the reality, in addition to just the economic factors and the social factors of being flooded with drugs and violent people. Tell people that the Canada you grew up with, Pierre Trudeau's Canada, I once believed in the ringing ideals, and I'm not saying they're all wrong, the melting pot or the tossed salad. And I'm just saying something has gone off the rails. And if you're a Canadian, recognize that a war somewhere abroad is going to mean, in our reality, our modern reality, that there are going to be people in Canada interested in the results. They will be working on you as a Canadian, and crime is part of that. And so what does that mean at the high level? Yeah, again, I love the Charter of Rights in many ways, but we're not living in Pierre Trudeau's utopian vision anymore. And that could be a whole other hour or two of discussion. But I think if you want to talk to people, say, this isn't just about a castle law, which sounds very extreme, or people wanting to have a weapon inside their home. Up top, the worst and most dangerous crime networks in the world are taking advantage of our weak laws, to put it simply. And yeah, that's how I'd raise the conversation, because at the end of the day, everyone, they only want, their family to be safe and have a good job and some semblance that you're, secure and going in the right direction. And that's off the rails. Anyone at this point that is saying, it's not the Wild West, okay, Justice Minister, yeah, it's feeling like it, and I say it is.
Yeah, that's great advice. I appreciate that. Thank you. And again, I appreciate your time today, chatting with us. We love it. You're doing such great work, Sam. I'm interested to hear where you go with sort of the Muslim Brotherhood down that line and everything else in that space. I do know a bit about it, but I look to your reporting to get a much better in-depth view of things. So I'm very grateful you're spending time on that. Thank you. Anything else from you?
No, yeah, just thank you from me as well. I'm every day I'm checking out the Bureau and appreciate all the work that you do. And while I'm also thankful, I'm also sad at the picture that I've come to understood by your work. But I don't think that we get rid of problems by ignoring them. To quote Ayn Rand, you can ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the stage we have now entered, where we are dealing with the consequences of ignoring reality. And so thank you for helping paint an accurate picture of that reality,
as dark as it may be. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.